Hello there. Greetings. Welcome to this episode of the Ipagtanggol ang Tagapagtanggol podcast. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. I am Alessandro Kin de La Paz, and I'll be your host for this episode.
Hi, I'm Miguel Nicolas V. Aviles, and I will be your co-host for this episode of Ipagtanggol ang Tagapagtanggol podcast. And we have other speakers as well who will introduce themselves.
Hi, I am Mary Elizabeth D. Manos.
Hi, I am John Ray C. Guido Pagaran.
Hi, and I am Alfred Eric Hisuan.
Okay, so hi Al, hi Mary, hi Guido, and hi Miggy. So today we are going to talk about Sustainable Development Goal number 13, also titled as Climate Action, and the topic and issue at hand, which are the killings of environmental defenders in the global, Philippine, and Mindanao context.
So first, for this podcast, we have 5 parts. For part 1, we're going to give a background of the social problem. Then for part 2, we're going to connect that problem to our SDG goal, which is the SDG number 13, which is titled Climate Action. Then after that, in part 3, we're going to dive deeper into the issue of the killings of environmental defenders. And then in part 4, we're gonna talk about our personal responsibilities as well as our actions that we can do, like right now. Lastly, in part 5, we will summarize and conclude this whole episode of Ipagtanggol ang Tagapagtanggol podcast.
Thanks for that, Miguel. Yes, there are 5 parts for this podcast. And to proceed to part 1, which is the background of the problem, first we will talk about the killings of environmental defenders in the global context. Then in the Philippines, and then lastly in Mindanao. Climate change is already a big problem for mankind. It is real, and we are already experiencing it. In fact, some even say that this might be the biggest challenge humanity has ever to face. However, with climate change being a big enough problem already, now even the environmental defenders, the very people who are doing something to combat climate change, are being killed. So now we have another problem to deal with. So for the global context, according to the Global Witness in 2022, since the year 2012, over 1,733 defenders have been killed. And that's an average of about one defender killed every 2 days over 10 years. They also stated in 2021, 200 defenders were killed, which is equivalent to nearly 4 people a week. The top 5 being first Mexico with 54, Colombia with 33, Brazil with 26, Philippines with 19, and lastly India with 14 casualties. For me, we do really need to look out for our environmental defenders, the people who are already combating climate change.
I absolutely agree with you, Alessandro. For now, in the Philippine context, according to Global Witness, by the way, Global Witness has a really comprehensive review of the killings of environmental defenders in the past decade. Anyway, according to Global Witness, in the Philippines, for land and environmental defenders, we remain one of the worst places to be in the world. In Asia, however, we are not just considered as one of the worst, but we are indeed the worst. In the last decade, 270 land and environmental defenders were killed, and as mentioned in the global context, 19 were killed in 2021. In the Global Witness report, they also stated that over 80% of the killings in the country over the past decade were connected to protest by the defenders against company operations, with a third of them linked to the mining industry. Philippines ranked second with 6 casualties behind Mexico with 15. In my opinion, this is absolutely crazy. Why? Because Philippines is such a small archipelago. It's just a small country, and yet it is able to make its way to a list such as this. I just find it ridiculous because in Asia, again, in the world, we are already one of the worst. There are already around 190 plus countries in the world, and yet a small archipelago like the Philippines made it to the list. And again, in Asia, we are already the worst. And one irony, also ironic, what's also sorry, what's also ironic in that is that the Philippines is also the country already that's already experiencing climate change, the effects of climate change. So for me, again, it is absolutely crazy that we're on that list.
I agree with you, Miguel. I also find that crazy. Now, moving on for the Mindanao context. In Mindanao, there are different tribes and indigenous people. So, land and environmental defenders in Mindanao are not an exception to killings. According to Global Witness, in the 270 land and environmental defenders murdered in the Philippines over the last decade, over 40% of them were indigenous peoples campaigning to protect their land and the environment. They also stated that nearly 80% of those 40% attacks against indigenous defenders occurred in Mindanao. In my opinion, we really need to collectively stop neglecting the indigenous peoples in Mindanao. We should we should start valuing their rights as well as stand up for them. So how about you, Jan and Al? What are your thoughts on this?
Um, for me, I absolutely agree that the fact that an archipelago such as the Philippines can make it to the list is absolutely baffling. And it shows how much of a big problem this one is.
I agree with you, John Ray. For me, I also agree that we really need to take rights of the indigenous people more seriously, especially because it has been a pressing issue for a long time already.
Thanks for sharing your opinion, Guido and Al. I found that really insightful. And I especially agree with you, Al. I do agree that we do really need to take the rights of the indigenous people more seriously. And so moving on to part two, our Sustainable Development Goal, or SDG in short, is number 13, which is climate action. For me, I think this one is pretty straightforward. The SDG's goal is to simply combat climate change. In fact, the official mission statement of this goal is to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. So, connecting that to our topic, obviously, before we can focus on climate change, we must focus on protecting the ones who are already doing something about it, right? Because once we address that, we can move on to focusing on climate change altogether, collectively.
I guess, yep. So, yeah, I absolutely agree with you that we need to really collectively fight for climate change, but before we have to like fix this division between the environmental defenders and the ones targeting them. And then maybe if we fix that division, then maybe we can collectively fight for against climate change. So yeah, I absolutely agree with you. Also, there's also a term called climate justice. When I first heard it, I thought it was just another term or synonym for climate change. However, when I looked it up, climate justice, I saw that climate justice means finding solutions to the climate crisis that not only reduces emissions or protect the natural world, but that do say do sorry, but that do so in a way that which creates a fairer, more just, and more equal world in the process. This is in correlation with our topic and our SDG, which is the protecting the environment along with the environmental defenders who are not who are not who are always victims of injustice, especially in this especially in defending their home because they did not do anything wrong at all. All they did was stand up against climate change. All they did was stand up for their homes, protect their homes, fight climate change, and yet they're the ones who are getting killed for it. That's pretty much it for part two.
Thanks for that, Miguel. Moving to the part 3, the topic is about killings of environmental defenders. However, before we do that, let us talk about the value of our environment first. Now, this is very straightforward. The environment provides everything we need to live, such as the air we breathe, the food we eat, the water we drink, and a lot more. We're also just byproducts of our environment. Therefore, we are part of the environment. With that being said, destroying the environment would mean destroying ourselves with all of the other living things.
I absolutely agree with you. The environment is indeed very important. Now to proceed with the topic, which is the killings of environment defenders, as set in the global context, according to the Global Witness, in the last decade, globally since 2012, 1,733 defenders have been killed. That's an average of one defender killed every 2 days over 10 years. They also stated that in 2021, 200 defenders were killed, which is equivalent to nearly 4 people a week. The Philippines, being a small archipelago, was still able to find itself in the top 5 in Asia. The Philippines are considered the worst in the last decade. 270 defenders were killed in the Philippines, and in 2021, 19 were killed. We also have to take account that 80% of these killings the past decade were connected to the protests of the defenders against company operations, with a third of them related to mining. This implies that our economic system is broken because profit and power fuels it. 40% of the killings in the past decades were indigenous people as well, 80% of which occurred in Mindanao. Lumad tribes who protect their homes are mostly especially vulnerable.
Okay, so as we all know, climate change will keep on going. That is why any problem related to climate change should be addressed with utmost urgency.
I'm going to have to agree with you, Al. Climate change has been no stranger to us. The climate crisis has been going on for quite some time, and it's only getting worse. Despite the various actions that have been taken across the globe to mitigate climate change, sorry, this problem still seems to persist. But that does not mean we should give up. In fact, that is more reason for us to keep going and to fight for our environment and our climate in our own small ways. And with that being said, let's proceed to part 4, personal responsibility and action. This part is also pretty straightforward. Firstly, we can stand up for the environmental defenders, support them, advocate for them, and others. Moving on, secondly, we can do our part in fighting against climate change. And that's either through practicing the 3 Rs, volunteering in cleanups, using public transportation, or walking, and a lot more.
I absolutely agree with you. Also, that I agree with you that we can do even as just us. We can already do a lot of stuff that could help combat climate change. So even though sometimes that we have these problems, maybe school task or work, these environmental defenders have been really facing a lot of they're facing a lot much worse. So like in the global scale or the scale of the problem that these environmental defenders, the least we can do is really is follow this, either practicing the 3 Rs to reuse, reduce, or recycle, volunteering cleanups, using public transportation, or just walking, cycling and walking, by the way, can also benefit you because it's exercise and a lot more. So yeah, also to add to that, youth involvement is also important because the youth is the next generation who will soon take over and deal with these problems. After this, the youth it's important for the youth to be already trained and honed and shapen up and exposed to these pressing issues because soon enough, the youth, the kids right now, they will be up there in the podiums, maybe in UN, they will be up there advocating for the issues, not just limited to climate change or the killings of environmental defenders, but in general in these SDGs. That's why youth is also really important. So that's for part four. That's our responsibility. That's our responsibilities and the actions that we can take for now and maybe in the short run and maybe later in the long run. So yeah. So to proceed to part five, the last part, which is the conclusion, we're gonna summarize everything in this episode. First, in part one is the background of the study, wherein we set the context of the topic issue at hand, i.e., the killings of environmental defenders in the global, national or Philippine, and local or context or local and local or Mindanao context. Then in part 2, we connected SDG 13, also the SDG titled Climate Action, to this particular issue. Then in part 3, we went deeper into the issue of the killings of environmental defenders. Then last but not least, in part 4, we talk about our personal responsibilities in this issue and the actions that we can do to combat not just the issues of the killings of environmental defenders, but as well as climate change in the whole.
Wow. Thanks, Miguel. That seemed like a lot to take in, but it's true. This crisis that's going on regarding our environment and its defenders is no joke. And I'm really glad that we've had a chance to discuss the problem and talk about some valuable points. I think this podcast has been very informative and insightful. So I'd like to thank those of us tonight, Miguel Aviles, Alfred Kisuan, John Ray Guido Pagaran, and Mary Elizabeth Manos. That pretty much sums up this whole episode. Thanks especially to those of you watching at home. Make sure to catch us on the next one. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening.